Well, it truly is a pleasure to have James Sweet here on campus. I am very excited about this because as a graduate student, when I was first starting my PhD, I read his book, Recreating Africa, and I think it was probably one of the most exciting books that we had that semester, talking about how Africans who were enslaved and taken to Brazil took their identities and their culture with them and created something new that was also African in Brazil. So I'm really excited to have him here, and I don't want to take too much time listing all of his accomplishments because I want you to hear from him. But as was said before, he's a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of History at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's also intimately involved in the nationally ranked African Studies Center there, which it's been exciting to have someone from that place come as well. His interests in African and African diaspora history range widely, and I think his publications show that. He's produced award-winning scholarship on the social and cultural histories of Africans in the Atlantic world, including Recreating Africa, and also about Domingos Alvares, I think that's how you say his name, about African healing and the intellectual history of the Atlantic world. Here you can see the book cover. He also serves on a number of editorial boards and has acted as a consultant to scholarly institutes and even policy initiatives. So his opinion and his expertise are highly valued, and I will, again, not take too much time and just turn the time over to him. So thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. After this is all over, I'm not sure how much you'll value my opinion, but first of all, thanks to the Kennedy Center and to Africana Studies for hosting this talk. It's always a pleasure to get out and talk a little bit about my research and to get feedback, especially from students and young people who may or may not read the entire book. So I'm going to spend some time here today, actually. Leslie had asked me to talk about Domingos Alvares, which is, he was the topic of my most recent book. So what you guys are going to get here today is a sort of synopsis, if you will. I was busy trying to scratch things out on my way in here because I don't want to take all the time. I want to leave some time for you guys to ask me questions. So the title of the paper I'm giving here is, it's been truncated a little bit in some of the promotional literature you all got. So the long title, which wouldn't fit on the poster probably, is Today He Cures, Tomorrow He Kills, Domingos Alvares, African Healing and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World. It's very long. It's sort of like the book title. Basically, what I'm going to tell you is a biographical story, and it's unusual in that regard because we don't really have that many biographies of enslaved Africans. And I should say from the outset that my own research interests are focused on first-generation Africans. In other words, people who were born and mostly raised in Africa, who find themselves caught up in the Atlantic world, oftentimes as slaves, and carried to places in the Americas. And what I'm trying to do is to try to understand their sort of social and political and cultural worldviews as they move through these different worlds. And Domingos Alvares is an exceptional figure in that regard. Between 1730 and 1750, so we're talking about the 18th century here, Domingos Alvares traveled the Atlantic world like few Africans of his time. From war-torn Dahomey to the slave societies of Brazil to the rural hamlets of Portugal, he traveled this world all during this sort of short period of time. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. So this is a map, basically, sort of outlining the broad contours of his travels. Using this biography as sort of a prism through which to analyze broader patterns of forced migration and diaspora, I highlight the complex social and political ambiguity that defined the history of the 18th century Atlantic world. As a powerful healer and vodun priest, Alvares cured hundreds of people across the Atlantic, yet these cures were rarely a simple matter of remedying illness and disease. Public healing actually became a crucial tool for rendering modern intellectual categories, making them more comprehensible and ultimately more African. In 1727, the kingdom of Dahomey appeared to be at its apex. And let me pause here for just a second to sort of give you an outline of what I'm going to be doing here. In order to sort of tell Domingos Alvares' story, I'm going to set up a sort of context for his African background before I turn to the sort of meatier part of my project, which is his experiences as an enslaved person in Brazil who eventually gains his freedom and is actually ultimately sent to Portugal. So the first part of this paper is setting up his African background. By taking control of the port town of Ouida in Dahomey, and you can see Ouida down in the southern part of this particular map, Dahomey seemed poised to access the direct spoils to the European trade along the coast of Africa. Dahomey and King Agaja boasted an army that was the best trained, best equipped military in the region, consisting of some 10,000 regular troops, as well as various apprentices, servants, and hangers-on. But consolidation of the victory that he achieved at Ouida would prove much more difficult than Agaja had anticipated. The early promise of imperial power and easy wealth was interrupted by years of warfare and disruptions in the interior. The exiled Ouida, who fled to the west during the 1727 invasion, continued to contest Dahomeyan supremacy at Ouida. More ominous still was the kingdom of Oyo, which you can see up here, the Yoruba-speaking kingdom to the northeast of Dahomey, whose mounted cavalry struck fear into even the most hardened Dahomeyan soldiers. This was unusual. The cavalry of Oyo was well known for its military prowess. Just 1 year before Dahomey took Ouida, Oyo invaded Dahomey, killed and enslaved large numbers of soldiers, and burned Abomey, the capital, to the ground, forcing Agaja to flee to the bush. Agaja attempted to enter into negotiations with Oyo in 1727, but these negotiations failed. Beginning in 1728 and continuing for 3 years straight, Oyo marched on Dahomey every dry season in an attempt to overthrow Agaja. By 1730, Oyo took the Dahomeyan capital of Abomey, forcing Agaja to transfer his capital to Alada. So he moves to the south here, right here. These setbacks were not interpreted as mere happenstance, these military setbacks. Indeed, political challenges intertwined with spiritual challenges. Temporal failures were understood to be directly related to the failures of the gods. In response to the abrupt shift in political fortunes, Agaja instituted a policy of appropriating the deities of conquered peoples, importing their shrines and priests to Abomey, where they were integrated into the official royal pantheon. One of the prime motivations behind this shift in policy was the immediate political threat presented by vodun priests and their devotees. The healing skills of the priests attracted people from across the region, especially those who were forcibly exiled by warfare, in some cases permanently alienated from their homelands. So in other words, warfare created refugees and migrants who then gravitated around these healers. As priests attracted more and more devotees, they increasingly threatened the political legitimacy of the monarchy at Abomey. Agaja hoped that the policy of assimilation would ensure the loyalty of the priests and their growing congregations, but he already feared potential rivals that were plotting to overthrow him. In 1732, the English trader William Snelgrave observed that Agaja had, quote, grown exceedingly cruel towards his people, being always suspicious that plots and conspiracies are carrying on against him. Particularly suspect in these plots were the priests and devotees of Sakpata, the vodun of the earth. Sakpata is a generic term for a larger group of deities associated with the land. However, by the 18th century, it was understood primarily to be the vodun of smallpox, a disease that had devastating impacts on Dahomey. Snelgrave noted that Agaja himself was pitted with the smallpox. Outbreaks were noted in 13 different years between 1708 and 1734. During these epidemics, nearly half of the population could become infected, resulting in population declines that approached 10% a year. Compounding these losses from disease, periodic famines killed many thousands in the region. Agaja possessed one of the most feared armies in the world, but he was powerless against the forces of the earth vodun, which could give or take life at its own caprice. The only people capable of intervening under such dire circumstances were the Sakpata priests. Individuals afflicted with smallpox went to the priests in search of ways to placate the angry god. The priests prescribed offerings to the vodun, medicines for the sick, and so on. When people died from the disease, the priests were the only ones to handle the bodies, and they were responsible for arranging proper burials. For those who escaped the ghastly death from the smallpox, the priests prepared festivals of ritual thanks, at which the survivors swore their devotion to the vodun. As congregations swelled around these priests, Sakpata priests gained tremendous political power. New adherents included not only commoners, but also local chiefs and elders, whose affiliation with Sakpata undoubtedly shaped their political outlooks. Logic demanded that Agaja's reign of terror could not be disentangled from the simultaneous terrors wrought by smallpox, famine, and dislocation. Disease, hunger, and exile were mere symptoms of a much broader calamity. One way of appeasing the vodun was for people to join forces in opposition to the Dahomean army. Balance could be restored to the land, and again, remember this is the vodun of the earth, by defeating the imperial usurpers and restoring rightful chiefs to their kingdoms. In this way, Sakpata represented a potential cure, not only to the immediate maladies of things like smallpox, but also to larger ones like the imperial ambitions of Dahomey. Agaja responded to the challenges of Sakpata in the most practical political way that he could, given the untenable circumstances. The king might have preferred to eradicate all worship of Sakpata, killing the priests and destroying their shrines. Indeed, this is a question that I often get. Well, why didn't he just kill all the people who were opposing him? And it's a reasonable question. But this would have risked a much broader political uprising among Sakpata devotees. So the key thing I want to point out here is that there's a relationship between what we might call religious activity or ritual activity and politics, right? Moreover, Agaja probably genuinely feared the ire of the vodun, which had already demonstrated its ability to punish him on more than one occasion. Still, the temporal challenges of the Sakpata priests were intolerable. The challenge of Sakpata was thoroughgoing to Agaja: political, social, cultural, and economic. Indeed, for many in the region, Sakpata appeared to be the only true king of the earth. As anthropologist Melville Herskovits has put it, the king of Dahomey could brook no competitor, not even the king of the earth, and hence the king of the earth must be banished. And it's that banishment where the story really becomes interesting. Since Agaja could not kill Sakpata priests, he chose to neutralize them by selling them into the Atlantic slave trade. By the late 1720s, a young man who would eventually come to be known as Domingos Alvares was around 18 years old. And I say he would eventually come to be known as Domingos Alvares because obviously that wasn't the name he was born with in Dahomey. Alvarez, who grew up in the village of Nalgon in Agonli-Cove, which you can see here, and this is the region known as Agonli-Cove. He would later recall that his parents, and this is a quote from him, his parents are already dead, and they were called in the language of his land, the father Afnaji and the mother Okanon. Each of these names suggests strong linkages to the world of Vodun. Domingos' mother's name, Okanon, means possessor or mother of the land in the Fon language. Her partnership with Afnaji, or the king of the land, reinforces the notion that each was a servant to Sakpata. Taken together, the names of Domingos' parents suggest important roles in the leadership of a Sakpata congregation. Most tellingly, Afnaji, or its variations, stands at the head of the Sakpata pantheon and is most often represented as a position of leadership in ritual settings. And this continues to be true to the present day. Afnaji's marriage to Okanon reflects the normal pattern of shared male-female leadership in the healing communities of the Gebe-speaking region. We might thus reasonably assert that Domingos' parents were more than simple devotees to the Vodun. They likely were priests or Vodunon. If so, Domingos stood to inherit his parents' role as a spiritual leader, the position of Vodunon being tied to lineage. The responsibilities of the Vodunon were considerable. As the possessor of the Vodun, the priest embodied the Vodun as the living link to the spirit world. The Vodun chose the priest, or one of his earlier direct ancestors, by means of supernatural revelations, indicating how and where to establish the original altar to invoke the Vodun. So shrines are created in gesture to the Vodun. The priest passed this knowledge on to devotees whose worship and offerings propitiated the Vodun, but it was always the priest who orchestrated ritual and provided ultimate authority on the esoteric knowledge necessary to satisfy the Vodun and bring harmony to the community. The content of Domingos' spiritual training is mostly knowable, but the context is not. We can imagine that in early childhood, Domingos was able to absorb much of the knowledge that was at the core of his parents' belief system. Come on. Doesn't want to cooperate. This was a time of relative peace in Agonli-Cove. Domingos would have been raised around the shrine and among the congregants of Sakpata with the knowledge that he would one day succeed his father as the congregation's spiritual leader. After 1720, there we go. Just decided to change. This is a Mahi village in the region of Agonli-Cove at a much later period of time in the 19th century. I threw it up here just as an example of the kind of village that Domingos might have grown up in. After 1727, sea changes in the social and political terrain of the region radically transformed the role of the priesthood, as one might imagine. Refugees, exiles, the starving, and the disease swelled the membership of these congregations. Political pressures mounted as Agaja began to proscribe the vodun and its adherents, sending them mostly into the slave trade. The gravity of these social and political power struggles could not have been lost on Domingos. Since he claimed that his parents were already dead, we can assume that he witnessed their passing. Their deaths only heightened his awareness of the socio-political tensions, hastening his graduation into the ranks of the priesthood and thrusting him into the role of community leader. Exactly how and when he took the mantle of vodun is unclear. What does seem clear is that by the time Oyo and Dahomey began their warfare in 1728, Domingos Alvares was already a powerful spiritual and political leader, one of those Sakpata priests who was a prime target of enslavement by Agaja and the army of Dahomey. When Domingos Alvares was enslaved, sometime around 1730, his healing techniques were already proven in addressing the illegitimacy of one of the most powerful armies in the world. Nothing about his enslavement would have transformed his belief in the power of the vodun. Indeed, his enslavement was a direct consequence of that power. And this is something that's important because we oftentimes think of slavery and the slave trade as being, sort of abject captives who were being sort of swooped upon by sort of people trying to take advantage, whether they be Europeans or local African headmen. But in fact, in this case, people were being enslaved. Someone like Domingos was being enslaved precisely because of his threat, his political power. And I think it's an important sort of intervention in that regard. So this was an admission on the part of Dahomey that Sakpata priests, quote, knew too much magic. According to oral history, they were sold away because, quote, they made too much trouble. When Domingos arrived in Pernambuco in the northeast of Brazil, the ills that plagued him in the larger community of enslaved Africans often derived directly from slavery itself. So in other words, the illnesses or the sources of pain and the maladies change, right? In other words, things change when you move to the Americas. But just as Agaja's army unleashed associated calamities like famine and disease, so too did the institution of slavery. As a healer, Domingos was bound to address these ills at their roots. On the one hand, Domingos' healing practices served to protect slavery, as he cured all range of maladies in the slave community, from snake bites to stomach illnesses to skin lesions, ensuring that individual slaves would live to work another day on behalf of their masters. On the other hand, Domingos' personal attacks on the broader institution set him firmly against the interests of slaveholders. Domingos vehemently rejected the work of cutting cane in the northeast of Brazil, sugarcane, insisting that he should be allowed to cultivate his healing practice. His demands not only implied the freedom to go into the hinterlands to collect medicine, an unacceptable example for other slaves, but also the freedom to build new healing communities, communities that might grow to threaten the patriarchal power of the planter. Just as King Agaja could brook no competitor, neither could the kings of the cane. At least one neighboring sugar planter issued a standing order to his overseer. If Domingos appeared on his property, he was to be forcibly removed because of his fame as a fetisher. Ultimately, when Domingos' master denied his request to go into the hinterlands to collect herbs and roots, Domingos' cure was efficient and deadly. He poisoned his master's family, their slaves, and their cattle. As a reflection of this duality, those in the slave community of Pernambuco said of Domingos, "Today he cures, tomorrow he kills," hence the title. The attacks on his slave master landed Domingos in jail. Feeling lucky to have survived and fearing further attacks, Domingos' master sold him 1,000 miles south to Rio de Janeiro, where he continued his assaults. On the passage to Rio, the ship's captain accused Domingos of casting a spell that prevented the winds from blowing, thereby impeding the ship's forward progress. So he's sold south to Rio. They get on the ship won't go. The ship's captain blames Domingos for it, right? When the crew pulled Domingos on the top deck, tied him to the mast, they stripped him of his clothing and began to punish him. There they found in his possession a pouch of empowered substances containing herbs, roots, and so on. This pouch was removed, its contents emptied and burned. After Domingos was whipped, the wind stirred and the ship sailed to Rio without further incident. When the ship's captain arrived in Rio, he, quote, gave thanks to God that he was able to sell Domingos. Domingos' arrival in Rio in 1737 created a buzz in the slave community, and the news of his skills eventually reached slave owners. Leonor de Oliveira Cruz, the wife of a planter, had for many years been suffering from a chronic illness that Portuguese doctors failed to cure. Several days after Domingos' arrival in Rio, a slave traveled to her house to make her a pair of shoes. Recognizing that Cruz was suffering from some ailment, the enslaved cobbler asked if she had heard of the, quote, great curer who has arrived from Pernambuco. Cruz had not heard. However, her house slave, Teresa, knew Domingos from Pernambuco, where they had been friends 4 or 5 years earlier. So this is another interesting moment because even though Domingos is sort of punished and sold south, he manages to find people that he had actually known earlier more than 1,000 miles away. So Teresa confirmed that Domingos was a powerful healer and recommended that her master purchase him. On Teresa's advice, Cruz and her husband, Manuel Pereira de Fonseca, brought Domingos into their home, hoping that he might heal Cruz's illness. So in other words, he was sold south because he was a criminal, and now all of a sudden he has power to heal, right? I mean, they want him for those reasons. However, when Domingos arrived on their property, he immediately entered into disagreements with his new masters. Just as had occurred in Pernambuco, Fonseca refused to allow Domingos the freedom to go into the woods to collect his medicines, fearing that he would run away. Domingos complained to several people that his masters treated him like a common fetisher, and that they should find a person of respect to purchase him so that he could engage in his healing practice freely. Soon, Cruz's health took a turn for the worse. Moreover, her young son began suffering from an unexplainable illness. Fearing that Domingos was trying to kill them, they turned Domingos over to the custody of the governor of Rio, who held Domingos until a new owner could be found. In early 1738, José Cardoso de Almeida, who described himself simply as a businessman, approached the governor with a request to avail himself of Domingos' services. Among his business interests, Cardoso owned several small farms outside the city, and some of his slaves suffered from illnesses he hoped Domingos might cure. Cardoso carried Domingos to his farm, where Domingos proceeded to have great success in healing the ailing slaves. Once Domingos completed his work on the farm, Cardoso allowed him to heal freely throughout Rio and its hinterlands. Noting that, quote, in very few days, Domingos could bring 1 dobra in earnings for his master, Cardoso resolved to purchase Domingos from Manuel Pereira de Fonseca. Cardoso paid 150 mil-réis for Domingos, about 25% less than the average price for a male slave in Rio in the 1730s. So he got a discount because Domingos was dangerous and the master wanted to get rid of him, right? And this was also a sale that was brokered by the governor, no less. It's a really interesting sort of moment. Fonseca believed he was offloading a dangerous and unproductive slave who was a threat to public safety. He was relieved to cut his losses. For Cardoso, on the other hand, Domingos represented a tremendous economic opportunity. Even if we assume that Domingos only earned 1 dobra per month, he could pay his value of 150 mil-réis in just under a year. Follow me on that? So, if you're thinking about this purely in economic terms, in terms of an investment, the master was making a great investment here. In fact, it seems that Domingos earned far more than that. As his reputation spread, Cardoso fielded dozens of requests for Domingos' services, some from as far away as 50 kilometers. During this time, one woman claimed that Domingos came to her house to cure her, but before he even began, he demanded 2 dobras, in other words, twice what he originally was asking for his cures. She summarily kicked him out of her house, but the price demanded by Domingos indicates his rapidly increasing economic power. Unable to meet the demands for Domingos' services, Cardoso eventually set him up in what he called a public house in the center of Rio de Janeiro where his clients could come for consultations. During this time, Domingos enjoyed the protection of his master and apparently even the governor, who endorsed his sale as a healer in the first place. Cardoso owned Domingos for just over a year before he finally granted him his manumission, having made a sweet profit in the meantime. As a freedman, Domingos continued healing, establishing 3 healing centers that literally ringed the city of Rio de Janeiro, as well as a ritual ground on a small property in the southern outskirts of the city at the foot of one of Rio's most important Catholic churches. I'll pause here just for a moment to point out. So if any of you know Rio de Janeiro, it's a massive sprawling city now, but its sort of historic center is a pretty well-defined region. And in this period, and I'll show you some images in just a second that sort of demonstrate this, but when I say that his healing centers literally ring the city, so he has one here. This is the original one, the central one that he had. There's another one here, and then his his sort of ritual healing center just for people of his own sort of ethnic background is right here, and I'll show you an image of exactly where this is in just a moment. But you can see he sort of has like a monopoly, right, around the city. This is in the early 1740s. Let me go ahead and show you these while I've got this out. Come on. There we go. So this is, if any of you have an image of Rio, it probably doesn't look like this, but this is the time period. So it's a tiny village in some ways, right? When I was doing the research for the book, I actually took a walk around this area, and what I do with that map that I just showed you a minute ago is sort of take Domingos on an imaginary walk through Rio de Janeiro. In fact, I'll talk a little bit later this afternoon about using Family History Center records, and that map of walking through the city was facilitated in part by those family history records. So, but this tiny little village right here is Rio de Janeiro in the 1730s and 1740s. So it's a manageable little town. For its time it was a city, but it was small by today's standards. The ritual ground that he established for his own people was actually at the base of this Catholic church. So I mentioned earlier that on a small property in the southern outskirts of the city, at the foot of one of Rio's most important Catholic churches, Nossa Senhora de Gloria, the ritual ground consisted of a small house and a yard where chickens were raised. There was also a large orange tree, beneath which there was an altar that included many calabashes in the center, a large earthen vessel of water, fortified with herbs, leaves, and powders, with a knife stabbed into the center of the vessel. His followers, mostly female and mostly from the so-called Mina coast, which is the Bight of Benin, gathered on Saturdays to divine and heal. Among his adherents were a handful of initiates, including ones known as Captain, Old Man, and Long-Bearded One. This is all the translation in the Portuguese. It's dangerous stuff here, but the Saturday healing sessions usually followed predictable choreography. Those seeking therapy arrived early in the morning, at which time Domingos passed black chickens over their heads of each person in order to sweep away the evil spirits. Then the assembly was ordered outside to gather around the altar. Domingos threw some leaves and black powders into the vessel of water with the knife stabbed in the center of it. Then he ordered the ill to put their fingers in the middle of the water. After a short time, the congregation began moving in rhythm around the altar. Eventually, one or several of the initiates were possessed by the deity. For example, during one of the ceremonies around the altar, in the middle of the circle was a black woman, quote, dancing and jumping like she was possessed by the devil. Again, these are the Portuguese writing about this, so you've got to take my context at face value. Making his way to the center of the circle, Domingos cast some black powders at the woman he called Captain, prompting her to fall to the ground, quote, like a dead person. So they're moving around the altar, and then all of a sudden she drops like a dead person. Domingos walked up to the prostrate woman and with a staff in his hand rapped to the ground next to her head. The woman immediately arose, taking on a different persona and speaking in an unintelligible language. Then Domingos took a calabash and placing his finger over the mouth of the vessel, he clapped the bottom with his other hand and also hit it against his thigh. Removing his finger from the hole, a cloud of smoke emerged. Domingos commanded the woman to inhale the smoke. He also wafted some toward her ear and her head, which, quote, provoked her and infuriated her further. Domingos placed his finger on the back of her head and began asking the captain questions to learn what made the others ill. The captain proffered her divinations, answering that some had fetishes, others suffered from this or that illness, and so on. Domingos responded to the captain's divinations by choosing the appropriate herbal remedy for each of his patients. He then ordered another of his disciples, a man named Barbaças, or the long-bearded one, to administer the medicines. As his following grew, Domingos gained unwanted attention of the Catholic Church hierarchy. And remember, by this time he's freed, right? So he's gained his freedom. Catholic priests raided his healing center in the western part of the city and pursued him for months, until 1742 when the Portuguese Inquisition finally arrested him and sent him to Lisbon for trial. And I threw this image in here simply to point out that the African presence in the Atlantic world, which is oftentimes associated with Africa and the Americas, also has a deep resonance in European contexts. This is actually in a neighborhood in Lisbon, which to this day has influences or sort of residues, if you will, of a very strong African past. This is the street corner. The translations of these are sort of Jewish crossing and the street of the Black's Pit, which is a reference to the place where Africans were buried. So this is literally the intersection of Jewish way and Black burial ground. And this is a contemporary street corner. These are the names of the streets, right? So, Domingos is taken by the Portuguese Inquisition in Rio in 1742 and transported to Lisbon. Just as with Agajá and the sugar planters, the Inquisition's charge that Domingos, quote, had a pact with the devil was a threat to another king and his followers, in other words, God and the Catholic faithful of Rio de Janeiro. And this is the actual frontispiece document to a very long Inquisition case that was brought against Domingos. And that is, for those of you who are interested in, how do I know this story? It's largely drawn from a 700-plus page manuscript set of Inquisition cases, actually two different ones. Domingos' arrest by the Portuguese Inquisition exposed deep contradictions in the assumptions about definitions of slavery and freedom. As the slave of José Cardoso, protected by the patronage of no less a figure than the governor of Rio de Janeiro, Domingos was free to heal as he pleased. However, as soon as he gained his legal manumission, his freedom, he became subject to arrest by the Inquisition. In essence, he was freer as a slave than he was as a freedman. It's a radical proposition, I know, but Domingos underscored this reality when, on arrival in Lisbon, he consistently claimed that he was still the slave of José Cardoso, even though we know he was freed by this time, right? He also lamented the loss of a wife and a young daughter forever left behind in Rio. Domingos endured jail, multiple interrogations, torture, and eventual banishment to the Portuguese Algarve. However, his verbal sparring with the Inquisitor Manuel Vilas-Jartz y Tavora reveals a keen understanding of Catholic doctrine and highlights Domingos' own skills as a debater and philosopher. Essentially, Vilas-Jartz demanded a simple confession that Domingos had formed a pact with the devil, and this was common practice among the inquisitors in Portugal and Spain and elsewhere. Faced with detailed descriptions of his ritual practices, Domingos stood fast to his story. All of his cures were natural, he possessed no hidden virtues, and he never parted from the Catholic Church. Domingos clearly understood that Vilas-Jartz wanted to elicit from him a particular type of confession. After 9 long weeks and 4 different appearances before the Inquisitor, a stubborn Domingos still would not break under Vilas-Jartz's questioning. He denied invoking spirits for divinatory purposes, he denied predicting past and future events, and he denied using ritual prayers or words in his healing. In short, he avoided any suggestion that he channeled the powers of ancestors or voduns. Domingos was acutely aware that the Catholic hierarchy reduced these powers to the workings of the devil. Sadly, he may have been a victim of his own intellectual and cultural acumen. Had Domingos made a full confession of his transgressions, admitting that his healing powers emanated from the devil, he might have saved himself from the torture that was to follow. Yet it is precisely Domingos' intractability that should give us pause, lest we conclude that he was a mere victim of a cruel and overzealous Inquisition, which of course he was. Domingos would not subject his faith to facile Christian reductions, nor would he reveal his faith's secrets. Instead, he used his skills to draw out the hidden truths of his inquisitorial adversary, just as he had done numerous times with his clients. Vilas-Jartz's insistence that Domingos' ritual practices were the work of the devil was an admission of his belief in Domingos' extraordinary powers. The belief in the power of African malevolence was a refraction of Portuguese assumptions about the redemptive power of God through colonialism and slavery. Africans like Domingos could be rescued from the devil's clutches only through the intervention of the Catholic Church. When Domingos argued away the presence of the devil in his cures, he exposed the hypocrisies of the divide between Portuguese good and African evil. Indeed, with the devil removed from the equation, Vilas-Jartz faced the heretical prospect of a much more universalist spectrum of therapeutic possibilities. That the powers of African healers might be on the same moral and spiritual plane as those of God and the Catholic Church was simply unimaginable to him. Domingos may have won the larger philosophical argument, but in Vilas-Jartz's eyes, he was an inveterate liar. Behind the mask of superior logic, the devil surely resided. Refusing to cede to Satan's trickery, Vilas-Jartz accused Domingos of criminal libel and once again ordered him to return to his cell. Days later, the Inquisitor subjected Domingos to torture on the rack, crushing his joints and bones until he cried for mercy. In June 1744, Domingos marched in the Lisbon Alto de Fé, where he heard a public reading of his banishment sentence to the tiny town of Castro Marim, agreeing to abide by, and this is the Alto de Fé, which is itself a sort of carnivalesque rendering of the crimes of people before the Inquisition. So he marched in one of these Alto de Fés and was punished by exile to Castro Marim. Located at the Spanish-Portuguese border near the Mediterranean Sea, so if you can imagine in your mind's eye the border between Spain and Portugal on the Mediterranean, that's where Castro Marim is. Castro Marim had long been a destination for Portugal's criminal exiles. Nevertheless, Domingos claimed that people there abhorred him and that he couldn't find any way to make a living. Thus, he broke the terms of his banning order and basically went walking across the Portuguese Algarve. This is the sort of banning order, and what's important about this for our purposes is that in each of these cases, Domingos is forced to make his mark. I mean, he's illiterate. He doesn't read or write, but he does make the sign of the cross next to his name here. So there's a sort of living example of where he was there. So he broke the terms of his banning order and fled Castro Marim. As he walked across the Portuguese Algarve, he tried to weave together the threads of social connection that might once again allow him to form a healing community. However, unlike in Rio, he could find no community that shared his worldview or his history. Domingos sold sardines, he worked in a hostel, and he divined the location of buried treasures supposedly protected by half-Moorish, half-serpent creatures. According to local legend, these treasures had been buried as North Africans fled the Iberian Peninsula hundreds of years earlier. That Domingos glammed onto this local knowledge and utilized it to his benefit is just one more indication of his remarkable flexibility. In addition to these endeavors, Domingos continued to heal. On one occasion, he cured a woman named Domingos Andrade, who was suffering from paralysis below her waist. Even after Andrade regained the use of her legs, her husband refused to pay Domingos the amount he thought he deserved. Then, one day, Andrade stepped outside her front door and immediately flew into a terrified frenzy. According to witnesses, she, quote, ran about disturbed and acting like she was crazy. The cause of her hysterics? A bundle of objects left on her front doorstep consisting of, quote, a doll with 39 pins, human hair, some blonde and others black, dog hair, snakeskins, sulfur, chicken feathers, pieces of glass, half a bottle with 2 packets of pepper and corn kernels, some bones, and grave dirt. Andrade immediately set out to find Domingos, who told her that the things at her door were fetishes for her, for all the people in her house, and for her cattle and her farm. In response, Andrade and her husband denounced Domingos before the Inquisition yet a second time, setting Domingos into almost perpetual motion as the Portuguese Inquisition pursued him across the countryside. In July 1747, as he passed through the town of Silves, secular authorities apprehended Domingos. Though the exact circumstances of his arrest are not spelled out in the record, his initial detention may have been for something as simple as vagrancy. He would have been a truly odd spectacle in the rural areas of the Algarve, a tattered, hungry African man embellished with bolsas and beads and veronicas, a number of different sort of talismans, if you will, carrying a cane tube full of medicines and a sack with various other healing implements. Among the strange objects found in the bag was a, quote, small rock taken from the head of a jackfish. Domingos later confessed that he threw this rock into herbal baths as part of the treatment for kidney stones, another cure he learned in Brazil. Whatever the precise circumstances of his arrest, the Holy Office in Évora had been pursuing Domingos for almost 2 years and was closely monitoring news of his whereabouts. On July 15th, the Évora Tribunal issued an order requesting that Domingos be turned over to their jurisdiction. They also ordered that he be confined to the inquisitorial jails in the city. Less than a month later, Domingos arrived in Évora, where he once again faced a judicial inquiry before the Portuguese Holy Office. By the time of his arrest, Domingos had been in the Algarve for nearly 3 years. During that time, he traveled hundreds of miles on foot, moving frequently from place to place, trying to eke out a living wherever he could. Domingos' position in Portuguese society scarcely resembled the elevated status he enjoyed in his homeland or even in Brazil. In those places, his skills were widely acknowledged as crucial to the maintenance, and this is the route that he walked across the Algarve, just as an illustration. In Brazil and in Dahomey, his skills were widely acknowledged as crucial to the maintenance of community well-being. Ties of reciprocity between Domingos, the local community, and the world of the spirits were recognized and respected. In this way, Domingos became an integral force in the creation and continued vitality of social networks that defined individuals by their temporal and spiritual relationships. Despite his best efforts to serve new communities and forge new social networks in Portugal, nothing could transform his singular status as an exile, an outcast, and a social pariah. Everywhere he went, people recognized him as a colonial convict. Some people abhorred him, while others selfishly sought to capitalize on his alleged powers. As a result, Domingos constantly remade himself in order to curry favor, to adhere to Portuguese expectations. He was variously called a healer, a virtuoso, and a fetisher. In one town, he cured illnesses with herbal baths, Catholic prayers, and the sign of the cross. In the next, he peered inside the earth, spoke to enchanted Moors, and discovered incredible riches. He conspicuously wore Catholic holy objects, yet he also carried a sack full of fetishes. Most of his clientele knew that he was from the Mina coast in the Bight of Benin and had spent time in Brazil, yet he allegedly told some people that he was from Angola. Whatever the social context, Domingos seemed to have an appropriate answer. It's tempting to see these various transformations in the Algarve as ingenious, resistant, or even heroic. It's a good picture. They were, of course, all of these things, but we must temper our urge to celebrate Domingos' extraordinary adaptability. The image of Domingos as this sort of polymorphous, triumphant trickster belies a starker reality of surviving by one's wits, constantly fleeing the specters of temporal and social death. Struggling daily against the threats of homelessness, hunger, and physical violence, his alienation from Portuguese social life was indeed profound. The basic narrative of his confession before the inquisitors in Évora spells out this painful quest for survival. Near Mertola, he healed Maria Mestre with herbal baths, infusions, and balms made from sheep's lard. Though he knew, quote, that her illness was syphilis, in order that she would better reward him, he told her that her pain was fetishes. When she recovered from her illness, she gave him, quote, lots to eat and drink and 1,200 heish. In Alqueria, he provided cures only for some things they gave him to eat, which he requested for the love of God. In Faro, he faked his ability to find buried treasures, quote, because he did not have anything to eat and they could give him something. In Portimao, he unsuccessfully attempted to cure Catarina Varela, but Varela's husband, José Pacheco, still, quote, rewarded him with some money and something to eat. Altogether, these explanations suggest that abject poverty and desperate hunger drove Domingos to perform whatever roles were necessary to elicit compensation from his clients, even if this meant forsaking his own vast body of knowledge and beliefs. Domingos was tried by the Portuguese Inquisition at Évora and found guilty of breaking the terms of his banishment order. He was sentenced to public whipping and a further banishment order, this time to the northeastern town of Bragança. Domingos never made it to Bragança to serve out the terms of his exile, or at least that is the way it appears in the documents. Under normal circumstances, the tribunal at Coimbra would have sent a note to Évora acknowledging that he arrived there safely. Likewise, the inquisitorial notary at Bragança would have sent a note to the tribunal at Coimbra confirming Domingos' arrival to serve the terms of his exile. No such records exist. Nor does Domingos' name appear again in the records of any Portuguese Inquisition tribunals in the years immediately following his second exile order. If indeed he remained in Portugal, he ceased his healing practices or concealed them well, neither of which seems very likely. Nevertheless, it is possible that the documentary records from Coimbra were simply misplaced, and Domingos lived out the rest of his days in Bragança in quiet, solitary misery. Even more improbable, Domingos might have absconded from his penitential obligations, fleeing toward the coast and out into the relative safety of the Atlantic. For those insistent on holding on to the image of a defiant, irascible Domingos, this ending holds great appeal. Unfortunately, history rarely adheres to such uncomplicated romanticism. The likeliest scenario explaining Domingos' fate is grimmer. At around 40 years old, he was no longer a young man for the time. He'd suffered more than 10 grueling years of slavery and spent more than half of his 7 years as a freedman in ecclesiastical jails. This accumulation of hardship and physical abuse may have finally taken its toll. Given the apparent absence of any record of Domingos in Portugal after his release from jail in Évora in November 1749, it seems likely that he perished before arriving in Coimbra, unaccounted for and unrecorded. In the end, Portuguese institutional power managed to neutralize Domingos and many others like him, but not before these Africans made a profound impact on the intellectual discourse of the Atlantic world. These African intellectuals offered an alternate language of health and healing that simultaneously defied the socio-economic outcomes of imperialism and sought ingenious translations of them. The ambiguities and apparent contradictions embedded in this discourse were the natural outgrowth of political conflict and compromise that emerged in new communities, as well as old ones, as in Dahomey. By challenging mercantilist and expansionist expressions of imperialism, while at the same time weaving itself into the fabric of colonial slave society, this alternative political discourse of health and healing revealed that, quote, the capitalist empire turned out not to be so consistently capitalist after all. Bureaucratic rule not so consistently bureaucratic. Remember the governor. The making of colonial subjects not so consistent in their ideas of what kind of subject was to be produced. These conclusions are not meant to endorse healing as the most viable solution to the historical problems of capitalism, slavery, and colonialism. Rather, they are meant to show that through the lens of health and healing, we can witness the fragmentation of European colonial ideologies, as well as African communal ones. In other words, I don't want to romanticize either side of this equation. I'm just trying to say that Africans made contributions to the larger Atlantic sort of intellectual discourse. These ideologies that I'm talking about here were never pristinely European or pristinely African so much as they were Atlantic. braided together in ways that made them both mutually distinctive and mutually constitutive of one another. And I have about 5 more pages of analysis that I'm just going to stop because I want to hear your questions, but I'm happy to talk more about sort of the conceptual apparatus upon which I'm building the story here. So I'll stop for now. Thank you.
So I know some of you may have to run your next class, but if you'd like to ask questions, please form a line at the mic. Tell us your name, what you're studying, and we'll take a few minutes for a few questions, please.
Don't be late. Run. I didn't squeeze it to 40. I tried. Sorry. Hi.
I'm a European Studies major. My name is Melissa Fitzgerald, and I'm curious about how we could better incorporate this into our history classes for colonialism.
It's a great question. I mean, in fact, what I'm trying to do here is to nudge and prod not just European historians, but American historians even, right? I mean, so let me back up. One would assume that this would be a part of the American story, right? Mm-hmm. So in the first instance, my challenge is to try to get historians of the Americas to cease to privilege the sort of revolutionary Enlightenment, all the stuff that you were very familiar with from your European history classes. But in other words, it's a sort of way of thinking about history that I think ignores and sort of pushes out of the conversation these very profound sort of interactions that happen between Africans and Europeans in the Americas and in Europe itself. So I think my first challenge is to try to get American historians to think more fully about ways of doing this. I do believe that there's a sort of the next frontier is getting European historians to more fully consider these things. I mean, as you've sort of noticed in the lecture, sort of as a side note, I talked about this very vibrant community in Lisbon, which as early as the middle of the 16th century, there are those who argue that at least 10% of the population of Lisbon was African and African descended. That's a story you don't hear about, the sort of African story of Europe during the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. I've written and talked about particularly the 18th century presence of Africans in Lisbon, and I think, again, it's a question of, part of it is the way that the historical profession is defined and the way we think about history, right? I don't see myself as a historian of places so much as I see myself as a historian of people. So I'm following this guy, I don't care, he's all of these things, but the profession itself is set up in such a way that, you know, European history, American history, African history, it sort of forecloses those conversations that cross those boundaries. And what I'm trying to do is pry those things loose and get people to more fully consider them. How you do it, I mean, I think we do it in our classrooms, we do it in our writing where we can. I would love to see it integrated more fully into like textbooks, but I think that's a little bit of a dream. So it's a good question.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Deborah Fletcher. I study psychology. Now, I am from Guatemala, and there's a strong tradition of healing, natural healers of sorts.
Sure.
My question would be, how can we separate the tradition of healers, as in spiritual healers, and the other tradition of actual herbs and actual medicaments kind of thing that are sometimes as effective as the pharmaceuticals? So anyway, I've just observed that they get put into the same category, even though one of them is kind of obscure and not as effective, and the other one is real.
Right. Okay. So you're asking the $64,000 question, right?
Do I get the money at the end?
Only if you can heal. So let me tell you that in the book, I actually talk at some length about this. Now, the first thing I need to say is that, remember, sort of modern biomedicine is not something that comes to the fore until, at the very earliest, really, the 19th century, right? So this is a period where healing, I mean, even what we would call sort of early biomedicine was fraught. I mean, we're talking about bleeding and also, so like quackery was the norm, right? So trying to parse out for individual healers what was real and what wasn't, I think is something that we can do looking backward, but in the historical moment, I don't think people were doing that. They were just looking for efficacy. So if something that we might call quackery happened to work, maybe by coincidence, it was not seen as separate from herbs and roots that actually might have been working. Now, having said that, one of the beautiful things about this set of cases, and you heard some brief allusions to it in here, I mean, like, he talks about, he's able to diagnose, he knows syphilis, he knows diabetes, and the diabetes one, and this is one of the ones I talk about in the book, he was using an herb, a root actually, that, and fortunately in the actual documents, they named the scientific name of many of the roots and plants that he was curing with. So it's not that difficult to go and actually look up those things and see what their properties are. Turns out that the one that he was using to treat diabetes is one that was actually, at the very moment I was writing the book, being still tested for treatments for diabetes in labs.
Wow.
So the point I would like to make is someone like this is an intellectual in ways that we can both recognize, frontally, in other words, in terms of biomedicine, but the bundle of knowledge and sort of the intellectual package that he brings is really a cumulative one. It comes from both this tradition of ancestral beliefs that we may reject, but it also comes from experiential sort of healing in the world and using roots and medicines that even today we're still experimenting with and perhaps even using to treat particular kinds of diseases. How his clients came to sort of understand those different things boiled down to the efficacy question. Did it work? And if it didn't work, they might try something else. If it didn't work serially, they would say he was a quack and move on to somebody else, right?
So it must have worked enough for
It did
him
work.
to have enough
this
belief.
is the thing.
Yeah.
Right. It
Yeah.
must have worked enough, or people believe that it worked. I mean, it's no different. We have faith in our doctors now, right? We go to the doctor and we submit ourselves to doctors sort of unthinkingly. I mean, at least I do now. I'm sort of brought up that way. We all are, right? If you imagine that these figures were not dissimilar from that, although the sort of medical terrain was much more fragmented and unclear, I think we begin to sort of get a picture of what that relationship might have been.
Thank you.
Good question.
Hi, I'm Madeline Lewis. I'm a public relations major. And my question, you might have mentioned this already, I might have missed it, but how did you originally find out about this man and decide to study him? And then where did you get your materials that you actually
Great
used in the
question.
book?
Yeah, no thanks. I mentioned it very briefly when I showed the frontispiece to the Inquisition case. So Leslie, in her introduction, mentioned my first book was this book called Recreating Africa, and a lot of the source material for that project came out of Inquisition cases. There I was looking primarily at West Central Africans from Angola and Congo who were going to Brazil, mostly to Rio de Janeiro, mostly in the 17th century. So an earlier period and a different group of Africans. Again, I'll reinforce what I said earlier. I'm more interested in people than I am in sort of nation states or places. So this was a group of people who dominated the enslaved community of Brazil, particularly in the 17th century, on the order of like 85 to 90% of the people who were arriving from Africa were coming from this region. So I wanted to know, that was that project, right? In the process of doing that work, I came across this case, this prosecution of Domingos Alvares, and I realized right away that he wasn't among the people I was writing about. But I also realized that a 700-page Inquisition case was ridiculous. And then I sort of paged through it and realized, it's two cases. He was prosecuted for crimes committed in Rio de Janeiro, then sent to Portugal, and then this second case that I just described for the doll with the pins in it. So he was, and each of those cases has a series of depositions given by people who knew him, who had known him in various places where he had been. So there's a really rich treasure, and he testifies. He gives testimony. The inquisitors ask him questions. He talks about his healing practices. So there's really rich, thick description of his practices in those cases. Once I finished the first book, it took me quite some time actually just to wade through. This is all manuscript stuff. It's not pretty and typed up like this. So it took me a while, worm-eaten kind of. Some of you guys have probably worked in these kinds of documents. It took a while just to figure out the story. And once I had the story, I began to see, at first I thought it would just be an article, but then it became clear to me that there was a real big story to tell here. So I used him as a vehicle to tell stories about these different places that he traveled and the people that he encountered, and then used his own sort of life story as a way to talk about health and healing. Along the way, I was able to sort of build an infrastructure around him in the time period. Fortunately for West Africa during this time, there's a fairly rich documentary record that's produced by Europeans. There's also a very rich set of oral traditions that I drew upon to try to help maps, historical linguistics. Methodologically, I had to be pretty capacious and pretty broad in my approach here. The African stuff is is more speculative, I think, than it is sort of ironclad in terms of the evidence. But yeah, I'm confident in it. Then on the Brazilian side, the figures who we encountered, I'm able to sort of cross-reference them through family history records, through notarial records. And so when he's in Pernambuco, I learned more about the genealogy of the family that he lived with and why he had to be sold south to Rio. I learned in Rio de Janeiro, there's a really rich documentation, notarial records, again, family history records, that I was able to sort of build a story about who he encountered and what he did in Rio de Janeiro. Then when he gets to Lisbon, the trial itself there's tons of material in the actual Inquisition case there, and then he begins to sort of fade out again toward the end of his life. So I don't know if that helps you see how I sort of negotiate. Yeah.
That's good. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for your questions, and please join me in thanking Professor Sweet.
Thank you all for coming.